2 of our 2-night mini webinar series, What's the Catch? New Jersey Seafood and Healthy Living. First night, we met last Thursday, October 14th. Lisa Calvo and myself gave presentations on New Jersey seafood production from fisheries and aquaculture, including the responsible practices and management adopted with those involved in our sustainable fishing and aquaculture industries. Tonight, we'll be hearing from 4 speakers. We're scheduled to go to 8 p.m. and the speakers are going to focus in on the health and nutrition aspects of seafood consumption. After the 4 presentations, we'll have a Q&A period during the end. So tonight's program with What's the Catch is through our Rutgers Cooperative Extension program. Rutgers Cooperative Extension is part of our New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. New Jersey is the land-grant university here in New Jersey. Our agricultural experiment station was set up in the 1880s to carry out our land-grant mission, focused on serving the needs of New Jersey's residents, communities, and businesses through research and education. Our history is deeply rooted in agriculture, increasingly also in time, environmental natural resource issues, fisheries and aquaculture, providing science-based information and research for stakeholders throughout New Jersey. Educators this evening, we work with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. We've been around for over 100 years. We have faculty and staff located throughout the state to bring the wealth of knowledge from the state university out to our communities. Our mission is to help a diverse population in New Jersey adapt to a rapidly changing society and improve their lives and communities through an educational process that uses science-based information. And our What's the Catch program, we're hosting it again this year in October. This is year number 2. October is National Seafood Month. So in recognition of the celebration of October's National Seafood Month, here we are again this year providing science-based information on New Jersey seafood production last week, and tonight on the health and nutrition aspects of consuming seafood. We have 4 speakers lined up. They're going to focus in on the health benefits of consuming seafood, mercury in seafood, issues related to labeling in seafood, tips on selecting affordable options in seafood, and safe handling and preparation to round us out for the evening. As I noted, we have 4 speakers, and that'll carry us. We'll expect to have about 15-20 minutes at the end of the evening for questions and answers. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A feature. I'm the host this evening, also the moderator. I'll be organizing the questions that come through the Q&A feature here in Zoom, and then we'll relay them to the speakers at the evening to get some answers on your questions and hopefully have a little bit of dialogue here in the webinar platform. We are recording this evening. The recording from tonight and last week will be made available to those who are registered as a follow-up after the program. So our 4 speakers this evening, I'll give a brief introduction in order in which they're presenting. First will be Rachel Tanzi. She's a senior family and community health sciences, or FCHS educator, extension associate with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Monmouth County. Our second speaker will be Lauren Erickson. She's a senior program administrator with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. She's also a PhD candidate in nutritional sciences at Rutgers University. Our third speaker will be Christine Zellers. She's a FCHS educator, assistant professor with Rutgers Cooperative Extension at Cape May County. Our final speaker this evening will be Joanne Kinsey. She's an FCHS educator, associate professor with RCE of Atlantic and Ocean Counties. So with that, I will turn it over to Rachel for our first speaker this evening.
Great, thanks, Doug. So I have the pleasure to discuss with all of you the dietary guidelines and the nutritional value of why we should really be consuming more seafood. So the dietary guidelines, just a little overview, is really a tool that is developed and actually reevaluated about every 5 years that allows Americans to sort of be guided and sort of giving them the understanding that under some science and, through the federal government and the public, we're really trying to give them the choices and explain to them the recommendations that would be for all food, not just seafood, but we really are giving the guidance so that people can pick the choices and have a healthier diet. So why seafood? This tends to be one of the foods that we probably as Americans don't eat enough of. There's been some studies done on that show we really are lacking in some of the areas to get our seafood into our diet. But in general, seafood really is very nutrient dense, and I'll get into that a little bit later. It's a super high lean protein that we can eat. It has great levels of fat, most of which very low, and great levels of saturated fat, which we also want low. And the sodium and the calories are also on the lower level. So it's really a good protein source, but there are some that, you would need to check. And if you have dietary restrictions, you would want to, discuss with a physician. However, it's also a great choice when we are trying to replace other foods such as meats like beef and poultry, if it's just an option to not have a animal source like that for the evening, or just to pick up something and get some of those other nutrients that we'll mention and get those into our diet. So the recommendation for adults is roughly 4 ounces, maybe about the size of the palm of your hand or about the deck of cards, 2 to 3 times per week. That's quite a few times. However, sometimes if you're doubling them up, having maybe 2 crab cakes or something like that, that would count, depending on the size of the crab cake, as more than 1 time per week. We really like to space it out so that you're getting the nutrients throughout the week as opposed to just getting them all in one time. However, we understand that sometimes that's harder and easier said than done, but we really are trying to recommend 2 to 3 times per week, 4 ounces. But then children who are roughly 2 years of age, about 1 ounce, which is not very much, and they're little, so they can handle that. But then as they age, so as they hit 11 or up, 2, 3, 4, we kind of are increasing their ounces so they get to that 4 ounce per serving and have that in their diet weekly. So this is just a graph showing what I was just mentioning earlier, that the recommendation versus what we actually eat. So the recommendation of the blue bars is really where we should be. So in general, men anywhere from 19 to 70 should really be at the higher level you see there, where anywhere from 7, 8, 9, ounces per week. We generally as Americans and the men category in those ages are much lower. The same would apply for women. This is a graph from a few years ago. However, it hasn't really changed much over the years, where you can see again, women as they are older, that's the ages you're making the choices, you're making family dinner or you're going out to eat, 30 and up. The bar in the blue is quite small and not really, we're not hitting the levels that we should be at. So we should be anywhere between 7 and 9 ounces, and we're really falling in between 3 and 5. So it's really some, areas that we can improve upon and try to incorporate it differently into our diets. And hopefully throughout the presentation, you'll find some ways to be able to do that instead of the same ways you've done it throughout the years, and get some, good feedback as to how to incorporate it more and more. So moving on to some of the seafood nutrition. So seafood itself is very good for our health. Typically, most fish are low in fat, as I mentioned, and a great source of protein. Very rich in your vitamins to help your immune system. And right now, I think we can all use a little boost in our immune system, but also our brain and nervous systems as well. The omega-3 fatty acids, a lot of people understand that we do need those, and they come in nuts and other foods as well. But fish is very rich in those omega-3 fatty acids, especially with our cold water fish. So those omegas are not only good for our brain, but also help with heart disease and possibly prevention of some of those ailments that come. And there's been some studies showing that could even possibly protect against some cancers as well. So having fish and shellfish in our diets as an overall sort of theme is really important to keep a balanced diet. We want to make sure that we're having all the proper proteins, always having a lean protein, always having the fruits and vegetables as well. So we're not just sort of having one concentration in one area, having the grains and the dairy and everything else. So we want to make sure everyone is having a balanced diet and understanding everything in moderation. So don't overdo it in one area, but make sure it's a nice balance. We're trying to also, as we are preparing our seafood or fish, trying not to use as much added fat or, sugars or anything that would be unhealthy. We really want to look for options like baking and broiling, grilling and steaming, and that will be referenced later on as well. So this is just a chart. I was highlighting certain things here with most of our New Jersey seafood, so that if you look on the left, the arrows up and down, we generally say if something is 5% or less, it's low in that area. And if it's 20% or more, it would be high. So blue crab can be found in New Jersey, and they have basically no saturated fat. So that's great. That's wonderful for your heart. But also they're about moderate with 10% of calcium. Clams, wonderful source. And that is great to find vitamin A there, about, again, moderate. So, that's only 12 small clams. I know when I eat clams, 12 is not the limit. So I might get 20% of, my vitamin A from eating clams, and a great source for iron. So that's very high in iron at only 12 small clams having 30%. Lobster, very low in calories and only 1 gram of total fat overall. Little bit pricey, but sometimes you can find some of the meat, maybe just the claws or just the tails. It's a little bit more expensive to buy the full lobster, but you can really do a lot with what you can get. Oysters, again, we're looking at about 12 oysters, have a moderate, little bit, decent amount of vitamin C at 6%, and then also very high in iron. Scallops, about 6 large or 14 small. I made scallops the other night, and I can say I definitely ate more than 14 small scallops, and 27 grams of protein. So it's a great protein source. And then tuna, being a cold water fish, really is wonderful because you will get a lot of those omega-3s and have a great source of protein as well. And then also some potassium there is a wonderful source for tuna. So fish and seafood alike really are one of the healthiest foods we could be eating. Again, making sure we're preparing it properly, it can potentially prevent certain heart disease. Those cold water fishes, as I mentioned earlier, would be salmon, tuna, bluefish, sardines, and mackerel. Even something like bluefish, we have a lot of in our house with fishermen. And if finding the proper way to prepare it really makes it delicious. And I think certain fish people get a little shy from because of that. But the amount of omega-3s and the fatty acids that are found there are really great for our brains, as I mentioned, and heart. And incorporating them into our diets can help reduce even triglycerides. If your triglycerides are a little on the higher side, over the course of time, you can definitely show an improvement, and your blood work would come back, potentially to lower those triglycerides as well. Having fish in your diet also, as I mentioned, just your blood vessel function, helping your heart and your lowering your blood pressure. So those omega-3 fatty acids have wonderful, amazing benefits for the heart. And there's one particular one called DHA, and don't ask me to pronounce that actual term, but the DHA is shown to provide a beneficial support to the brain. And that specific one really has helped show in research studies the improved memory function. So even having more fish into our diets and seafood as we age is really important as well, because our brain and memory tends to sort of decline as we get older, but the brain boosting benefits are worth having more fish in our diet. As well as the brain, also the nervous system can benefit from much of those fats and those healthy fats that are found in fish and seafood. So the more healthy fats, the better. So we just have to make sure that we're maintaining the unsaturated fats versus the saturated fats that are not so healthy. But fish and seafood in general, as I said, is one of the best sources for it. So having fish also increases your vitamin D. We know that vitamin D is typically your sunshine vitamin, and we get about 90% of it from the sun. You only need a few minutes a day, not necessarily getting sunburnt or anything like that, but just our normal walking in and out of buildings and being outside, watching a sports game or something like that. And about 10% will come from our food. So we really need to make sure as we are, supplying our body with the vitamin D that we have the other elements that help it be absorbed into our body. So having calcium helps create the strong bones and teeth, and also making sure you're getting a good vitamin C. And many fish, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, have both of those. So it is important to make sure you have a good balance there to make sure that you're getting the optimal heart health for your heart and muscles and nerves and brain. A lot of these things can be seen in many of the fish, but if there is a deficiency, oftentimes we see poor bone health in vitamin D. If we have a deficiency in vitamin D, even rickets, weakened immune system, and possible risks for cancer. So fish and seafood is also rich in B12. B12 often provides us some energy and sort of a little boost throughout the day. It's important for many of our nerve cells and brain functioning, not only our DNA, but also our RNA. And having those low levels of B12, sometimes we don't really necessarily associate that it's due to a low level, but we often are fatigued or might have a little bit of a dizziness or things like that. But having, maybe a test done and your doctor says, oh, your B12s are low, then having more fish and seafood and incorporating that into your diet could help you and definitely combat some of those issues that might come along. And the average adult, just about 2.4 micrograms each day. So it's not that much. And those 3 ounces of clams, that's not very many. As we were mentioning earlier, you're getting 84 micrograms in there of B12. So it's a great source for B12, and salmon even so, having just a 3-ounce piece of salmon is 4.9. So you're getting more than enough that you would need for any given day. So there's also many minerals found in our fish and seafood, like selenium, zinc, iron, and copper. Many of these are great for our immune systems and our brain function, as I mentioned earlier, but even selenium is important for our metabolism and enhancing thyroid function. Iron, we generally know, is very good for our hemoglobin and our blood. And then copper also helps our immune and nervous system, but could possibly even protect against diabetes as well. So overall, New Jersey seafood is highly nutritious and has very, very impressive benefits. There's not too many foods that really can say that it's so well-rounded and has all of these great benefits and healthy, prevention of certain illnesses, but really just keeps us healthy and gives us strong bones and boosts our immune and really sort of helps the overall body and all of the systems stay in check. So we want to make sure that everything is in balance. So as I mentioned, with our food being in balance, we also want our bodies to stay balanced. So having a food in our diet that is so impressive as this really does help everything stay balanced. So this is just back to those dietary guidelines. I wanted to point out here that we were mentioning all ages earlier, that even pregnant women, we are recommending the fish and seafood consumption because it actually helps promote the brain and spinal cord development of their babies. You'll often see in many prenatal vitamins that they'll say that there's omega-3s and DHA and things like that in those prenatal vitamins. So why not get it from your fish and have a better source and your body is readily able to use it? So of course, take your vitamins as well, but I'm just saying as you're eating your meals, incorporating a little extra fish and seafood into your diet would definitely benefit as well. Even young infants and children, you have to watch for certain allergies in the beginning. However, once you get past that stage, supporting their brain development and immunity is important as well. Same with teens. Teens, it actually is supporting their growth because they grow so fast. And some kids, grow 6 inches in, a few months. That is really important to help make sure that they have the proper diets to support that and help get them through puberty. And then adults in general, we were mentioning earlier, are strong bones and preventing possible osteoporosis. And then older adults could also maintain muscle mass and even potentially, macular degeneration and things like that. So it is really important for all stages of life to make sure that they get fish and seafood into their diets. So there's many, many options of seafood landed here in New Jersey. I just was pointing out a few. We have many different varieties, and you can really find them at many of your, fishmongers. You can ask oftentimes where they're landed and find new options. I grew up a lot eating monkfish, which, tend to taste a lot like lobster. So it was really delicious. We ate a lot of tuna. You know, again, having fishermen in the family, there's always bluefish and sea bass and things like that. So, you know, I find scallops are a wonderful kind of special treat, and we love to have them, especially being so close to the shore. Why not have them as much as you can? So it's really important to kind of support our local fisheries and also make sure that we are incorporating them into our diet to have those benefits for our own selves as well. This is just a tip sheet from, you know, the myplate.gov website, trying to incorporate having a variety of seafood into our diet, not just sticking to one thing, so that you're making sure you have all the nutrients that are supplied in the different fishes and different seafood. Getting creative, as I mentioned, with the seafood, and we'll get into that a little later with Joanne. Keeping it lean and flavorful, maybe try a salad or a sandwich. You know, we've had different things where, you know, tuna on top of a salad, but maybe having, you know, a different type of fish on your salad, or making it, you know, salmon salad instead of, you know, tuna salad, and making it into a sandwich. Potentially, you know, shopping smarter and getting, you know, friendly with your fishmongers and knowing what's, you know, the best options for you, and making sure as you're cooking it that you're doing it safely as well. These are just some guidelines, and again, they will be reviewed in a few future slides, but just making sure you're looking for a reputable source. As you're looking at different fish markets, make sure that, you know, you're maybe asking, where are they landed? Is it from the Jersey Shore itself? You really don't want your fish to have any particular odor. It shouldn't smell really like anything. If it does, it should be kind of briny and saltwatery sort of smell. It shouldn't smell bad in general. And if purchasing the shellfish, making sure that they're kept alive until they're ready to prepare, and make sure all fish is refrigerated and stored properly. So these are just some resources, and I think I'm going to hand it off to Lauren now.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. I am just going to pull up my slideshow, and then we will get started talking about mercury in seafood, which I know is a common question, and for some people a concern that comes to mind. So I'm hoping that I can clarify some of the perceptions or potentially misperceptions about mercury in seafood this evening. So as the dietary guidelines exist for consumption of seafood from a nutritional perspective, we also have guidance about safe seafood intake for select populations. So I'm going to focus on that tonight. The special subgroups that we're talking about with respect to mercury are women who are pregnant, women who might become pregnant, which broadly speaking includes women of childbearing age, which is about 16 to 49. Of course, there's some biological variability there, but that's the general age group that we're looking at. Women who are breastfeeding, and also young children. And the reason we're talking about these particular groups in relation to mercury is that mercury exposure in utero, so during pregnancy, is associated with impaired neurological development. This can influence thinking, learning, and other phases of development as children grow. So it is important to minimize mercury exposure, and the time that it's, again, most important is during pregnancy. So let's talk about mercury a little bit. Elemental mercury exists in the environment, and it's generally made available through human activity. Things like mining, coal combustion, and other industrial processes release mercury into the atmosphere, and it is eventually sometimes deposited into aquatic systems. So the mercury will essentially make its way to the seafloor, and in the sediment, there are microorganisms that will convert the elemental mercury into methyl mercury. And that's the kind of mercury that we're concerned with when we're talking about seafood, because small amounts of methyl mercury can build up in the tissue of aquatic organisms like fish through a process known as bioaccumulation. This can escalate through the food chain via biomagnification, so mercury levels can increase as big fish eat smaller fish. And this becomes a concern for us when we actually start to consume seafood. So even if the mercury is there in low levels, for vulnerable populations, it's something to keep in mind. So you might be saying, well, we just probably shouldn't eat seafood, right? We should avoid this. But as we heard from Rachel, there are so many benefits to eating seafood, especially those omega-3 fatty acids, which are so important for the development of a healthy neurological system, which are so important during pregnancy. So we're kind of faced with this question. How can we maximize the health benefits of seafood, but also minimize mercury intake for those populations who are particularly vulnerable? So we have guidance to help us do this. And the guidance comes from the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration, which have worked together to produce the joint advice to guide healthy seafood intake by the special populations we've talked about. So I'm going to give you a few notes about the advice, broadly speaking, and then we are going to dive in and look a little bit more closely at the recommendations. So this is developed to provide federal guidance for national use, and it's primarily geared towards consumers who are purchasing seafood. So I wanted to note here that if you and your family are consuming seafood that is sourced recreationally from local waterways, especially fresh water, you want to consult local advisories just to make sure that there are no mercury restrictions in place for where you might be harvesting the fish that you're going to consume. This advice includes seafood types for which there is consistent data. So if there are seafood types out there where the mercury concentrations are unclear, they're probably not included on this chart. It does take a precautionary approach, so it's erring on the side of keeping women and children as safe as possible. And one thing that's worth noting is that it sometimes does, but does not always include species-specific guidance. So you should basically look at the seafood type and find it on the chart and kind of go along with that type. Or again, consult local advisories for fish that you might be harvesting from particular waterways if you know that exact type or species of fish and you don't see it here on the chart. And I'll also just mention that, of course, women should consult their doctor and their child's pediatrician for professional and medical advice and dietary advice, above and beyond the scope of this presentation. So what does this advice actually suggest? The chart, which I'll show you again in a minute, is broken down into best choices, good choices, and choices to avoid. And this is, again, based on the potential mercury content. And that mercury content is dependent on things like the age, the size, and even the location of the fish when it was harvested. So the advice answers two questions. The first question being, which fish is which? So we're going to look at which fish fall into the best, good, and choices to avoid categories. And it also, like the dietary guidelines, addresses this question of how much, how often. For women, the advice is suggesting 8 to 12 ounces per week. And again, one serving is about 4 ounces. So you'll sometimes see that 2 to 3 ounces per week recommendation, which we'll talk about as we get into the chart. For children, again, reducing to age appropriate amounts is recommended. And the frequency in terms of how these two questions come together and which fish are eaten most frequently varies by category. And that's what we'll see as we take a closer look at this advice. So I'm going to start with the choices to avoid by this target group of women who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or planning to become pregnant, and also young children. And I'm going to work my way backwards to the best choices. So I wanted to highlight here, however, that there are some species on the choices to avoid list that are landed here in New Jersey. And these are great choices for other people who are not in this target audience or vulnerable group to try in moderation. So things like shark, swordfish, and big-eye tuna are coming into New Jersey and can help to meet the dietary recommendations for seafood intake. Moving on to the good choices, the first thing you might notice is that the good choices list is a little bit longer than the choices to avoid. So that's good news. The other good news here is that there are a number of seafood types on this list that are landed or sourced from New Jersey. So there are many local options that you can choose from the good choices list. And the recommendation in terms of frequency for good choices is for women and others in the target group to eat 1 serving per week. Again, 1 serving is about 4 ounces, and to avoid other seafood for the course of that week. Moving on to the best choices, the good news again here is that this list is even longer than the good choices list. So we have a number of choices, again, that are sourced or landed right here in New Jersey. Most of the things on the best choice list, actually, we can find locally. And the best choices are recommended to be eaten 2 to 3 times per week, or 2 to 3 4-ounce servings. So here are some resources for mercury guidance. And I am just going to move right into our next topic, which is selecting sustainable seafood. So like mercury, sustainability is becoming a question that we hear more and more about. So I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about what sustainable seafood is. So to answer this question, which is kind of a broad question, I went to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, website to see, what they have. And I basically have pulled from their information differences between how we might define sustainability for U.S. fisheries, which refers to wild-caught seafood, and U.S. aquaculture, which refers to farmed fish. And the good news is both in the U.S. are very sustainable. So sustainability with respect to fisheries refers to fishing practices that prevent overfishing. So we're maintaining the population health of fish stocks from which we're harvesting, minimizes bycatch or unintended capture of different types of fish and protecting non-target species, identifying and conserving essential fish habitat and maintaining the ecosystems from which we're harvesting the fish, and also considering social implications for fishing communities. Similarly, aquaculture practices take the perspective of rebuilding protected species and habitats, thinking about preserving the wild stock of seafood choices by adding to our overall seafood supply by producing farmed fish. Aquaculture systems are similarly focused on enhancing coastal resilience and coastal ecosystems. And by adding additional fish to our seafood choices by way of farming, we're improving our overall nutritional intake and also our food security here in the US. And finally, aquaculture also has a sustainability component of creating employment and business opportunities in coastal communities. I also took this quote from the NOAA website: "Sustainable seafood is a continuous journey." And I like this because I think it expresses a couple things. One is that sustainability is a target that we're continuously working towards. So our seafood systems are becoming more and more sustainable over time. And part of why that's happening is because we learn more through our fisheries and aquaculture science, as we do through our nutrition science, over time. And as the science gets better, we learn more, we can improve our practices, so does the sustainability improve with time. So some more good news that I have for you is that local seafood is sustainable seafood. So here in New Jersey, as you're starting to shop for local seafood, you might see seafood labels that say these selections are caught, landed, harvested, or raised in New Jersey. And these are all indicative that you found not only a local source of seafood, but a sustainable choice to purchase for your family. And I'm going to show some species here of different types of fish that are available in New Jersey and that are sustainable. New Jersey fisheries include the following. This is a very abbreviated list, so there are even more choices coming in that are sustainable. And New Jersey aquaculture, I'll just mention, primarily focuses on shellfish, such as oysters and hard clams. And for the specific practices and management strategies and production techniques that are used to bring this seafood to our table, I'll actually refer you to our night 1 of What's the Catch, which Doug and Lisa hosted last week. And they covered a lot of information about how these different types of seafood are actually produced right here in New Jersey or landed right here in New Jersey. and have a lot of good information about the details for how some of these production practices are contributing to a sustainable food system. And you'll see if you tune into that night one recording, the practices vary, but by seafood type, because there are differences in appropriate management strategies for each. But overall, big picture, the sustainable management is really looking to preserve populations of our wild caught species and also preserve environmental resources of our New Jersey coastline. So, spoiler alert, other states in the US are also landing and raising seafood, and that is also sustainable. The United States has some of the most responsibly managed fisheries in the world and aquaculture production systems in the world. So we're very lucky that we're in a really good place to be able to access local and domestic seafood that is produced in accordance with strong environmental guidelines. So to learn more about specific seafood, I recommend the NOAA fishwatch.gov sites. And this is a site where you can actually search by different kinds of fish. There is a selection option to search for wild or farmed seafood. And basically what you'll be able to see is looking for your select seafood type. You'll see an overview that references the sustainability of that species. And you'll also be able to see a little bit more about how that species is harvested and what environmental impacts it may have, including different types of environmental benefits from some of our production systems. So all of that said, what if I'm at the store and I see some seafood is on sale and I'm wondering, is it sustainable or not? Or I realize I need frozen seafood. What can I find in the frozen section? Or I'm just not sure what to choose. The first step is I recommend asking your seafood provider. Now, this might be at a local fish market where I'm sure the fishmonger will be able to tell you a lot about the different kinds of seafood options that they have there at the market. It might be at your grocery store. I have personally found that my local grocery store fish counter personnel is always really happy to talk to me. I don't know if they get a lot of questions, but when I go in and start talking to them about different things that I see in the counter, they always seem really happy. So you can ask the question, which of these fish are landed in New Jersey? So even at a local grocery store chain where you might not expect to find local seafood, there's a good chance that you might. So don't be afraid to ask the question. Another piece is that labels can also help. So if, for example, you're in the frozen section because you realize you're not going to cook the fish for 2 or 3 days, you don't want to buy something fresh from the seafood counter, but you're doing your grocery shopping on Monday, you're going to need frozen seafood for Thursday. You can look to package labels to give you some basic guidance. You might see broad sustainability terminology on the package in what we call the romance copy. That is kind of the part of the label telling you about the company or their commitment to sustainable practices. Some of them will even have a standardized logo or icon that they include themselves as the producer of that seafood. And you might see a third-party certification. So I'm going to just spend a couple minutes showing you some of the common third-party certifications that you might see. These are logos that had processes that have been verified by an independent third party. So it's a verification system, not identical by any stretch of the imagination, but similar to the USDA organic label being a third-party verification system for land-based agriculture production. These are similar certification systems for fisheries and aquaculture products. So one that you might see for wild caught fish is the Marine Stewardship Council logo. And from the Marine Stewardship Council, they base this logo certification around maintaining sustainability among fish populations, minimizing environmental impact, and having their fisheries comply with management regulations and laws in the different areas where they're fishing. You might also see farm-raised third-party certifications. These are 2 examples. One is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council logo, and one is the Best Aquaculture Practices logo. And these address different aspects of aquaculture production, from the animal welfare, water quality and nutrient and disease management, sourcing of the feed that's used in the aquaculture system, and also social aspects such as fair pay and treatment for workers who are involved in the aquaculture sector, and importantly, maintaining positive community relationships in the areas where aquaculture production is taking place. So, having shown you those few labels, I want to make the point that if you are sourcing local New Jersey seafood, you're probably not going to see a certification symbol on the package. That is perfectly okay. As we've talked about, New Jersey seafood is sustainable seafood. For one thing, if you're buying it hyper locally, there might not be a package at all to put on a label if you're buying it fresh out of the fish counter. So that's one thing. But more importantly, a lot of our small local producers or fishers may not obtain the certifications because it's very cost prohibitive. So it's an expensive process to become certified. So one of the best things you can do, as we've talked about, is to get to know your local fish provider. Look for the New Jersey label, look for New Jersey seafood, and learn more about what kinds of seafood are available, which you can do. I've put a website at the bottom of this slide for the New Jersey seafood availability website, and that can be a great start to finding more information about some of the things we've talked about tonight. So with that, I will say thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I am going to pass the presentation over to Christine Zellers.
Thank you, Lauren. I just need a second here to share my screen. Okay, good evening, everyone. My section tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about selecting and purchasing fresh New Jersey seafood, and dive a little bit deeper into what Rachel and Lauren have said. And then I'm going to talk to you about safely handling that seafood so that you keep yourself and your family safe. And we're going to find ways that are less expensive to enjoy New Jersey seafood as well. Beginning, we're going to start, like I said, with selection and purchasing of seafood. So buying seafood that's fresh and well kept by the fishmonger or grocer is really important to keeping you healthy and keeping you safe from foodborne illnesses. Getting the freshest taste is also another reason that you want to buy seafood that's good and well kept. And also you want to make sure that you're getting your money's worth, because seafood can be a little bit more costly. So when purchasing fish, it should be displayed on a thick bed of ice so it stays cold. When you go into the store, you want to make sure there's that thick bed of ice and the fish is sitting on that. The eyes of the fish should be clear and bulged, and the gills of the fish should be bright red if it's the whole fish. And when the skin is pressed on that fish, you want to make sure that it springs back up. Your finger shouldn't mush in there, because then it's going to be too mushy for you and it's not going to be good fish. If you're purchasing fillets from your fishmonger or from the store, then you want to make sure that they're not dry or dark green around the edges, because then it's a sign that it's going bad. You also want fillets, just like whole fish, to not be mushy and dry in the center. We want them to be fresh so that you can enjoy them. And fish that's off color, as Rachel had mentioned, or mushy, is an indication that it's old fish. So that's not something we want to buy and spend our money on. When purchasing fresh or filleted seafood, it should not have a strong odor either, as Rachel mentioned earlier. If you're purchasing shellfish, you want to make sure they're still alive. So if you tap on the clam, it should close, showing that it's alive on a shellfish like that. If it doesn't close, you don't want to eat it and throw it away if you've already purchased it. And don't use them if they're cracked or broken as well, because that's a sign that they're probably bad. Crabs and lobsters spoil soon after they die. So you want to make sure that when you choose them, that there's some movement left or before eating them, so that, when you're cooking them, there's a little bit of movement there beforehand so that they're not spoiled. And then finally, when you're purchasing frozen seafood, make sure the packaging is not damaged in any way, or it's torn or opened or crushed, because then it might have gotten exposed to the elements. Always check the seafood. Usually it's in a clear bag of some sort when you're purchasing frozen seafood. Always check it to make sure that there's no frost or ice crystals on it, because that could mean that the fish was old, or that it had been thawed and then refrozen again. And we don't want that either. And also, don't buy seafood that's stored above the frost line in the freezer or in the freezer case, because it may not have been kept at the proper temperature to keep it as frozen as you would have liked and keep it as fresh as you would have liked. I know if any of you have been on calls before with Rutgers Cooperative Extension or any of us, we always ask questions and polling questions. And after our team put the What's the Catch New Jersey Seafood and Healthy Living program together for 2020, we started to question why people don't eat the recommended seafood allowances that the dietary guidelines give. So when we presented our first presentation, we asked folks last year in October of 2020 to complete a survey and help us understand, why they might not be hitting the mark for eating the recommended amount. And then we presented again in the spring of 2020, and we asked people in the poll why they weren't necessarily eating. And we gave them different options, like the taste, the texture, not knowing how to prepare it. But one of the big answers that really stood out was cost. People said that it was cost. So we taking the information again, I always say we use it, and we did. We used that information. We added this information in for you based on that feedback. We wanted, we want to make sure that you are finding ways to eat it cost effectively, if that's one of the reasons you don't eat as much seafood as recommended. And just like fruits and vegetables that are less expensive when they're in season, so is seafood. Seafood can be less expensive when it's in season in New Jersey as well. And I'm going to share some more information on that in a minute. But try an option that might be less costly in season if that's keeping you from eating the amount of seafood that is recommended. Also, if you're unsure, ask the person. Like Lauren said, they're always glad to help in the seafood markets or at the seafood counter in the grocery store, and ask them what's on sale or what's in season so that you have that opportunity to buy seafood more cost effectively. And then when things do go on sale or are in season, try to buy a little bit extra, and then you can freeze it and save it for later and have it when, you might have a different type of meat. You can sub it out for that other kind of meat. You can freeze even clams and crabs as well. I'm going to send out some information on that after post presentation. And if you buy them in season, again, buy the clams in season, and then you can keep them later on if you freeze them. Try to save the more expensive seafood. We all have our favorites for special occasions. So I know Rachel mentioned scallops. That's one of the favorites in our house too, but they can be pretty costly. So if you save those for special occasions, then they're all the more enjoyable, and you have that special time with those if they're too cost prohibitive for you. Also, whitefish, which Joanne's going to show you in a little bit on the cooking portion of this presentation. Whitefish really makes a good filler that's less expensive, and it can be in season too, which can help. Try adding a flaky whitefish to a meal instead of, say, scallops, which will be a little bit more costly, and you're going to save those scallops for the special occasion again. Finally, try something new. Ask the fishmonger or person at the grocery store what the seafood you're purchasing tastes like. Ask them if it's mild or if it's flaky, how to prepare it. And that'll give you an idea of something maybe new to try that you haven't tried in the past. And also, we've made a lot of video recipes. Joanne's been very busy making those cooking demonstrations for New Jersey seafood. And we're going to share the link with you later in the presentation and some of the recipes so that you'll have some ideas about how to cook it, which can also, cooking it at home can help you to save some money on that. So the State Department of New Jersey Agriculture has a wonderful chart that can be found on the link at the bottom of this page. Which is actually, it looks like it might be cut off, but I'm going to send that to you later too. So if you can't see it, I will send that to you. But I took just a few of the different seafoods and broke them down to demonstrate the time frames when they're in season here to give you an idea. So for instance, clams, oysters, and squid, they're highly available in New Jersey pretty much year round. Dogfish, which I put in there for Doug because he's a big advocate of eating dogfish. Dogfish is moderately available all year long in New Jersey. So, that might be a little more cost effective for you if you're looking for something. The greatest availability for flounder is generally from April to June. For monkfish, it's May through June. Scallops are April through June, and again in late August. So they skip July there. Late summer to fall is the greatest availability for swordfish, and from July to September, and from July, and then again from July to September. Swordfish, or I'm sorry, mako is August to October, porgy June to November, and bluefish tuna are July to September. So I'll email you, like I said, that link post presentation to give you that resource. So if you're really interested in having that information on what is in season to help save money, that's a good way to do it. And this is just a breakdown to give you some ideas. They have a very elaborate chart, and I just kind of pulled some that I knew were popular so that you would have an idea of when it might be cost effective to purchase those. All right, so now we know how to purchase them and we know how to get them in season. Let's talk a little bit about storing our New Jersey seafood. Fresh seafood can be stored safely in the refrigerator for 2 days or frozen. If you're going to freeze it, you want to make sure that you wrap it tightly and then freeze it. Sometimes it's good to label it if you're going to have, if you bought a little extra, like I said, when it was on sale, maybe label it so you know what that is. Also, to thaw the frozen seafood after you've frozen it, you can put it in the refrigerator overnight. You want to make sure to put it on a bottom shelf so that if it does defrost and there's any juices, it doesn't get on food that you're not going to cook and contaminate that in any way. And then you also can do it under cold water. You can defrost under cold water if you like. You can defrost in the microwave too. And if you defrost, put it in the microwave, put it on the microwave setting. And then you just want to defrost it until the fish is like a little bit icy, but it's a little pliable too. To cook the food, Joanne's going to get a lot more into this. This is just an overall informational thing. 145 degrees Fahrenheit you want to cook it to. The flesh on the fish should be opaque and separate easily. When cooking scallops, they should be firm and opaque. And shrimp and lobster should be pearly opaque. And mussels, clams, and oysters should be cooked until their shells open. So a little bit more about the tips on food safety. You want to keep you don't want to have it out somewhere where it's going to spoil when you're getting ready to eat it. So make sure never to leave it out for more than 2 hours. So you never want your seafood to be out of the refrigerator or kept cold on ice for more than 2 hours. You never want to leave seafood out at an event or picnic for more than an hour, especially if that temperature is over 90 degrees, because that's when it's going to really start to have the possibility for having some foodborne illness on that. You also want to make sure that if you're catching the fish yourself, to put the fillets in an ice pack cooler in the shade. And it's important to have it in the shade so that temperature is not rising quicker than what you thought it might be. And then you want to use an ice pack cooler in the shade if you have seafood at a picnic. So again, make sure to keep that in the shade. And here are the references for this. And like I said, I'll have some follow-ups for you post presentation, and we'll be sending out a questionnaire too that we hope you will participate in. I'm going to turn it over now to Joanne. Oh, and here's my contact information, sorry.
Okay, let me get things set up here. Hello, everyone. And let me share my screen to get to my slides. And we'll be good to go. All righty, let's get started. The fun part, right? The cooking. What are we going to do with all this wonderful seafood that we're able to buy? We know what to look for in the purchasing. We want to make sure things are fresh, labeled correctly, and so on. So we know all that now. Now that we get it home, what are we going to do with it? Well, there's so many seafood cooking techniques that we're not limited to any one, which is really awesome, because that gives you so much flexibility with your seafood that you can experiment. You know, maybe it's baking, maybe it's grilling, it could be you know, baking in the oven if you can't grill outside, or just cooking it in a fry pan or something like that. So that's where the fun part really comes in. And if you like to experiment a little bit with your recipes like I do, then you can certainly have a good time with how are you going to cook your seafood? Are you going to try something new, pairings, and so on? So let's just look at the basic cooking techniques first, and you can see you're already familiar with all of these techniques that for some fish, baking, if you're cooking a whole fish, this would be pretty much the best way to go for that. If broiling is very quick with many types of fish, this obviously wouldn't work so well with a whole fish, but with your smaller seafood, your scallops, flounder, some of those types of fish, even the fleshy white fish, they work really well if you broil them. Most of them work very well when you're steaming. And in steaming, it's sort of an easy way to cook. Put some water under a steamer basket, and I'll show you this in a recipe in a few slides. You're not adding any fat or anything to the fish. You can certainly season it if you like, but the good thing about this is you can really control the amount of fat that you're using in your cooking. Grilling, again, really good choice. And some people just love having their fresh seafood on the grill because it gives us such a great taste. It does cook pretty quickly, and it's very helpful to have either a grill basket or a grill pan that you can use outside, or you can take some aluminum foil and poke lots of holes in it so that, you know, there's circulation for the heat, and the fat, if there is some fat or liquid condensation mainly, that would build up, that it would move away from the fish. Pan searing, this is an inside type of a cooking method, although you could do it outside on a side burner of a grill, and you're using a very hot pan when you're searing anything. Think about searing scallops. You know, if you've ever been to a restaurant where you have seared scallops, they have that nice brown on them, just slightly gives them a little bit of a sweet taste maybe, and they're cooked very, very quickly in a very hot pan. So be careful when you're doing that too. Smoking, also people just love smoking fish. You need to follow your directions with your smoker in terms of the time. You want to watch the temperature that you're cooking with. It adds a lot of flavor to your fish, and you might want to give that a try. If you've ever had it, you probably get a little bit hooked on it, right? You can also cook many types of fish in a microwave oven. Now, not everyone likes to use that method, but if you use a microwave safe dish that will have a lid on it that will capture the steam, then you're practically steaming the fish. So give it a try. Look for a recipe that gives you some suggestions for time and how long to be cooking it so you don't overcook your wonderful seafood product. And you know, this number one here right at the top, because I am the first one to admit that I did this horribly with oysters recently. Do not overcook your fish, your seafood. It gets very unpleasant. It gets really tough and not so good, and in some cases, like I did recently, not edible. So don't do that. Don't be like me. Make sure you cook your fish until it's just cooked, correct temperature, flaky, depending on what you're cooking, and then call it quits, because that's when you're going to have the best product in the end. Your fin fish does need to be cooked to 145 degrees, and you can use a meat thermometer and insert it very quickly. Just it only takes like 15 seconds in the thickest part of the fish. A meat thermometer like this is really invaluable in the kitchen. I know sometimes they're a little bit pricey, but you can find some pretty simple basic ones that will work very well for you. And you can use it on seafood as well as meat. But this is how you know you're at the right temperature, you have cooked something enough, and it helps you to avoid overcooking something. Your whole fish. Little bit of a rule of thumb to follow is that for every inch of thickness of the fish, okay, you may have to get out a little bit of a ruler and see just how thick your fish is. Maybe it's 2-3 inches or whatever. And you cook it for approximately 10 minutes per inch of thickness. So that's just a rule of thumb. And, you know, once you get a little practice with that, you may feel a little bit more comfortable with just how to go about that. You can test for doneness in cooked fish, usually with a fork. And all you have to do is take the tongs of the fork and just touch the middle of the fish a little bit, kind of see if it comes apart. And that's that's a great test to see if your fish is done too. It'll be a little bit flaky. It'll come apart very easily. It'll be very, very tender. And if you get to that point, if you just let the fish stand, take it away from the heat source, allow it to stand for 3 to 4 minutes, then you will have something that should be cooked pretty much perfectly. If you're cooking shrimp, lobster, scallops, then you're going to be looking for that opaque color that Chris was talking about. So your flesh of the fish should be firm. Not going to see it flaking too much. You may see it separating a little bit, especially with scallops, but the flesh will be firm and the fish will turn a little bit of a different color. It'll be a little bit more white. When you come to clams, oysters, mussels, the shell will open when they are cooked thoroughly. And as soon as your shell opens, that's the time to remove them from the heat source. And I'll show you that in a recipe in just another slide or so. If you have shellfish that does not open, you do not eat it. You discard it. Sorry, sometimes, you know, it's a little heartbreaking to maybe lose 1 or 2 clams, but you know, you have to do that. So let's talk about New Jersey scallops, certainly one of my favorites, and it seems to be a favorite of a lot of consumers as well. Pretty abundant here in New Jersey, and it's a wonderful source of protein. Obviously, it's very lean. There's no fat there. They cook very quickly, and they cook wonderfully in a variety of the cooking methods that we talked about in just a slide or so ago. And let's take a look at a New Jersey scallop Creole recipe that I adapted from a recipe that I was using years ago and never forgot about because I just always worked out so well. And all of these recipes that we're going to show you are available online. We have links to them. Some are on YouTube, some are on Vimeo, and you can actually see the demonstration of that. For this particular recipe, I started with a pound of scallops. Now, they can be costly, and this would easily serve 4 people. So you could always scale it back a little bit. A half a pound would work very well in this recipe. I don't know that we always need a full pound, but I used 1 pound, and I used about 1 cup pretty much of chopped onion, and I chopped it kind of large so that we could still have it be pieces in our recipe when it was finished. And I used red pepper and celery because I had celery on hand. You don't have to use that, but that is very nice if you do add it. And I used about 4 to 5 cloves of garlic. Okay, I'll admit I like garlic. It adds a wonderful flavor to food. If you are not agreeable with that, then take some of the garlic out, take all of it out. You don't have to use it, but it really does add considerable flavor. So this recipe really is kind of simple. I started with about 2 tablespoons of oil in a large skillet and added the fresh veggies to it and cooked it just for a couple of minutes. I did want to get them cooked a little bit, but not too much, under maybe a medium-high heat. That worked pretty well. And then I added a can of crushed tomatoes. Diced tomatoes would work very well too. If you, some people like I do, and I know some of my friends do, if we take some tomatoes and fresh tomatoes and we cook them down a little bit and we put them in the freezer and we label how many, like 1 or 2 cups is available in the bag, we can use that as well. So feel free to use whatever types of tomatoes you like to use. And I added 1 tablespoon of an Italian seasoning. Now this is your recipe. Be flexible with that. If you don't like Italian seasoning or something in it, then maybe it's oregano you like, or maybe it's a little bit of thyme or basil, or you like fresh. This is where you can have some fun with your recipe. So I added 1 tablespoon of a dried Italian seasoning and about a teaspoon of salt. And I put the lid over that, and I let it cook for, I believe it was maybe about 10 minutes. And if you look at the recipe, you'll see that's about what it is. So I covered it. I allowed it to simmer. It brings the flavors together. It cooks all the veggies that are in there, and it kind of brings the tomato into it and creates a really nice sauce. And then I took the lid off, took my scallops that were fresh, and I tucked them into the sauce, made sure they were pretty much in the sauce and covered, put the lid back on. 5 minutes later, it's ready. So this, if you have your veggies chopped and so on, this is actually a fairly quick meal to make for your family. I served it over cooked rice. A whole grain rice is good. I've also had it over pasta. It's really good that way too. So let's talk about clams. Clams we can get fresh in New Jersey year round. They are actually very easy to cook. I did a little video on steaming them, and Chris has done some other videos on some really good clam dishes that we'll show you in just a second. When you're working with fresh clams, though, when you purchase them, it's good to keep them on ice, not sitting in water as you're storing them. If you purchase them in the morning, you're going to use them later in the day. You might want to set them on top of ice in the refrigerator, but not soaking in it. And then you want to scrub them when it's about an hour before you're going to do your cooking. Scrub them under cold running water to get extra debris off of them. And then we take them and we soak them in clean, cool water for an hour. And during that time, they sort of purge themselves, and they clean the sand outside of the inside of let me say that again. They take the sand from inside of their shell and they push it to the outside into the water. So it really helps to clean your clams to allow them to soak for about an hour. Now I call it a steamer basket. I do have a metal one as well, but this one is a material that's a little bit more flexible that I really like for my steaming. Put it in my large saucepan with about 1 inch of water under it. Carefully place the clams on top of the steamer basket, put the lid on, and put the heat up to high. And my lids are clear, so I could keep an eye on what's happening. And as soon as the clams started opening, I started to remove them one by one as they opened and set them aside. Because if we leave them in the steamer too long, or we cook fish too long, it gets kind of rubbery and tough. You don't want that to happen. So removing them as they open is really kind of a good practice. If any of them do not open, we do not consume them. We definitely have to discard any shellfish that does not open. Steamed clams are super simple. You can take some butter and melt it down with some chopped garlic in it and allow it to sit before you start cooking this. And that makes a wonderful little dipping sauce. Fresh lemon wedges works really well. You might want to sprinkle fresh parsley on top, make it kind of fun, make it yours. This is one of Chris's recipes, and it's for clams casino, and they really are fairly easy to do. This recipe is also available online, and we started with 50 clams, cleaning them the same way we did before. And if you follow the recipe, you'll see that she had some onions and red pepper chopped up, and had to kind of toss everything together and use some bacon as well. So there you go for you bacon lovers. I'm sure you would love that. And they were broiled. So again, it's a fairly quick dish as long as you have everything prepared and ready to go. Okay, another recipe here, which, hang on just a second. I'm sorry, I'm multitasking. With your clams and white sauce, I highly recommend this recipe. It comes out just wonderfully. Chris came up with this one, and it's really very, very quick. Again, you're cleaning your clams, and you're going to be starting with creating basically a sauce in a nice size skillet with onion, garlic, and flour and some vegetable stock. And this works very well. You bring that to a simmer, you add your clams into it. So you're basically sort of steaming your clams right in the liquid or cooking them that way. And this is so quick and easy. It's wonderful over pasta. Whole grain pasta would be great. And some cheese on the top. Oh my goodness, super yummy stuff here. Let's talk about flounder, also known as fluke. This is very abundant in New Jersey, in our areas too. And it cooks very, very quickly, and it works well in so many recipes. This I would highly recommend if you're not very experienced with cooking fin fish. This may be a good starting point because it's very easy to cook, and it comes out very, very tender. So I wanted to come up with a recipe where we could create a stew where we could use some shellfish, and we could also use some flounder or fluke in it, and it came out really good. I had a good time with this recipe. It's delicious. And I went to the seafood market, and I bought just a half pound of scallops and a dozen clams, dozen mussels, a half pound of flounder. And I know sometimes this can add up in cost a little bit, but this would serve 4 people without a doubt. We even had some left over. And basically what I did was clean the shellfish, as we talked about before, let it soak for 1 hour so it would purge itself. And as that was happening, then I seared the scallops in a little bit of oil in a pan, about 2 tablespoons. And once they were seared, I set them aside. And when I seared them, we got that little bit of brown on them, and that's what really adds so much flavor. I set them aside from the pan and added a bottle of clam juice, excuse me, and half a cup of water, I believe it was, in with onion and garlic. And I let that simmer for just a couple of minutes to sort of get it going, maybe about 2 minutes. And then I added a can of diced tomatoes. And again, a little flexibility here. You can use tomato puree or crushed tomatoes. I happen to use the diced ones, and that worked out very well. Added that and allowed it to simmer for just a couple of more minutes. This goes pretty quick. And I simmer that means with the lid on. So it's sort of like steaming itself really good. I took the lid off after it simmered for a little, and then I added the flounder that I cut into 8 pieces. So I had half pound of flounder, cut it into 8 pieces, tucked it into the liquid again because it seems to cook really well that way, and put the lid on and allowed it to simmer for 5 minutes. This was absolutely delicious, and we enjoyed it the second day as well. It was absolutely maybe a little bit more work and maybe a little bit more expense than your typical evening dinner, but this is great if you're having a gathering, maybe a holiday dinner, or you just want to have something special. So give it a try. Crab cakes. This is one of Chris's recipes. And again, super simple and fast, starting with canned crab meat and she added a little bit of flour and egg, a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, mayonnaise, some mustard and parsley flakes, and shaped it into patties, into crab cakes. which works really well. They usually hold together pretty nicely. And she cooked them on a pan or on a skillet so that they could cook them on one side, and then she could brown them and turn them over. So you can do this in like on the stovetop in a large fry pan. You could do it in the oven, and just watch your time so you don't overcook it. Get it to the point where it's tasty and tender. How about tuna? Oh, super simple recipe with fresh tuna. It really doesn't take much at all. Just a minimum amount of your favorite seasonings. And you know, what are your favorite seasonings? Excuse me. We all have our go-to seasonings. Whatever works for you works really well. So what Chris did was she pressed her seasoning into each side of the tuna steak, and then she cooked them in a hot pan, and she used cast iron for this, as you can see. You can use pretty much any type of pan. It works really well. And just going to sear it very quickly. And as soon as they came out of the pan, then she put them into sesame seeds, and look at that. That is restaurant worthy food right there. Give it a try. So we have lots of recipes, and you can find them on a couple of different sites, and we'll share that with you. And one thing I forgot to mention, we think about this. We should consider using seafood as a swap for red meat in some of our recipes. So it works really well. We just created a newsletter on this that just made it into PDF form on our website today. And I'm hoping, Chris, that we can send this to everyone so that they can take a look at where the recipes reside and what are some simple swaps for, like, let's say it's Taco Tuesday in your house and you usually use red meat. Why not try fish tacos? And we talk a little bit in the newsletter about what types of fish to make for these various swaps. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Chris.
Actually, thanks, Joanne. I'll grab it from here. I'll be moderating this evening, and thank you very much to all four speakers for the great talks tonight. If I may, I probably should say it's a starfish studded cast, and you did a great job covering a lot of seafloor. I couldn't resist on tasty and healthy seafood options. So if anyone has any questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A feature. We'll go through them here. We got about 10 minutes left in the schedule. So we right now only have 2 questions. So we will have plenty of time if anything else is on your mind while we have the speakers on the hot seat. So first up here, we have a question. Let me grab it, a couple screens here. So Ed was wondering, I believe this came up during Lauren's talk. What is your impression on the Great Lakes seafood source, for example, salmon and trout, as a source perhaps compromised by pollution such as mercury?
Thanks, Ed, for that question. It's a good question, and I think this is a prime example of where it's important to recognize local advisories. So what I was sharing again was the federal mercury information and guidance. So if you look at the federal mercury recommendations, both salmon and trout are in the best choices. So the lowest likelihood of having mercury, that's the best choices, again, that we recommend for our vulnerable population to eat 2 or 3 times per week. But, you know, as Ed is bringing up in his question, that might vary locally according to specific water bodies. So I personally am not familiar enough with the Great Lakes ecosystem to comment on the mercury levels there. However, what I will do is share a couple of things in the chat. When I need to look for this information, that, you know, the places that I look, you know, being from Rutgers and affiliated with Extension and the university, is I look for other university extensions. And when we're talking about a seafood, sea grant organizations. So I'm going to put in the chat, actually one thing, another good source are local health departments. So the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has fish advisories. And it's not even for the entire Great Lakes as a whole, but it actually breaks down by county. So you can look at, again, hyper local recommendations And then the second thing that I'll share is a Michigan Sea Grants information source, which has basically an overview of eating safe fish and making safe fish choices in general. So that's not a direct answer, but how I would go about finding the answer to your question. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for that response, Lauren. Helpful additional resources. So next up, Ed was also curious. This question, I believe, came while Joanne was speaking. For broiling, what flavor types can be expected if done correctly? Any comments regarding the high temperature action on the fish flesh would be appreciated, as all cooking takes place at 212 degrees Fahrenheit until the water is gone, he noted.
Oh boy, lots going on there. In terms of seasoning, everybody has their favorite seasoning. You know, some people like to stick with salt and pepper, or maybe some specialty types of salt or peppers too. I have my favorite, like a blend of seasonings that I like to use. It's really up to your taste. And I think with any seasoning, whatever we're cooking, whether it's seafood or something else, we want to take it easy with it. We want to, you know, like kind of practice a little bit to see how much we need without going overboard. So, Doug, part of that question was about the temperature of searing.
Yeah, what Ed noted, any comments regarding the high temperature action on the fish flesh would be appreciated. He noted all cooking takes place at 212 degrees Fahrenheit until the water is gone, if that's true.
I'm not totally sure about the question there, but you know, when you're searing something, you have a very high heat, so it happens very quickly. If you are searing fish of any type, whether, you know, scallops or a whitefish or finfish, then it's going to happen quickly. So you want, it's usually a fairly dry pan. It may have some oil in it, maybe, and you know, I think olive oil or canola oil or something. It's searing happens without a lot of liquid. Okay, it's kind of a dry cook. So it's hot and it's fast. So you sear it on one side, could be a minute, could be 2 minutes. I don't even know if it would be too much more than that, maybe 3 minutes, depending on the fish. And then you're going to turn it over very quickly. So I'm not sure about using the liquid, but searing would not be using a liquid. I don't know, does Rachel, do you have any comments on that, or Chris? Chris has a lot of experience cooking fish.
I know, I think you answered it well. And I love, Joanne, that you added in about the spices. And one thing I'll add to that is I've started experimenting. You know, you mentioned the difference between the dried spices and the fresh spices. And I think that, or the herbs, I think that that really makes a difference. I do one dish that I put cilantro and chives in, and it really changed the whole, when I added the chives, it kind of made the taste all the difference. So sometimes it's nice to play with it, you know, put a little bit in, like you said, and taste it. But I don't have a lot of experience searing, so I really can't talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both of your responses. The only difference I would say for either broiling or searing is simply not only the type of fish, but the thickness of the fish. So some people are looking to sear, you know, when I've done tuna, I sear it, you know, very minimally. However, if you're going to be broiling a larger, you know, type of bass or something like that, that's thicker, it obviously is going to take a few more minutes. And even if you were to sear anything, you know, depending on your desired degree of doneness. You know, we're always saying we want it to be white and flaky and, you know, opaque. If it's a white fish, tuna, obviously it changes its color, but doesn't get quite as white. It kind of gets more grayish as it cooks, but I like it a little bit more pinkish. So it really just depends on your desired, you know, doneness.
Great. Thanks, team, for tackling that question from Ed. We have one final question right now in the chat, but if there are others from the audience, we'll have time for a couple more. And Lisa Calvo is with us tonight. She gave a presentation on the first night. Lisa, I don't know if maybe you can help in answering this as well. But the person asking the question noted they thought that bay water was needed to allow clams to purge. Fresh water might cause them to clam up and maybe not then be purged. Any insights onto purging clams, Lisa or others?
Well, I typically do add some salt to the water when I am working with clams. So it's probably will keep them a little bit happier and force them to open up better.
Great. I believe it's a good practice, although many of our local shellfish growers and wild harvesters, they'll also follow practices to purge them before they make it into the markets. So you should feel pretty confident you're not going to get clams full of sand. If you're out harvesting them recreationally, even before the kitchen, you can bring along some extra buckets and grab the seawater so that way you can purge them yourself and not have to maybe dirty up your kitchen as much. Cool, that's all we have from the chat. We have a couple minutes. I don't know if any of the speakers, after hearing each other's talks or some of the Q&A, you might have come up with any other bits of information you want to share this evening. If so, we can pause for that for a few moments.
I was thinking as Rachel was talking about the B12 that I always feel somewhat energized after I eat fish. And you know, a lot of times it's because it's that light, lean protein, I'm sure, that keeps you from feeling really weighed down and heavy. But it's interesting how our bodies, you know, get the different levels of energy from different things. And I think that fish is a really good substitute for meat. And, you know, the prices, there's limited sources for other types of protein right now in the grocery stores because of the pandemic. And I think that, you know, seafood makes a good option and might be a good way to steer if you get to the store and they're out of chicken or steak or something that you might be going for. You know, it might be a good way to add it into your diet and think about getting more seafood there.
That's a good point. I was actually going to say we often, you know, recommend maybe one or two meatless meals per week if you can, going more plant-based. But I find oftentimes when you're cooking with fish or seafood, you tend to actually make a healthier meal. There often is more vegetables involved and healthier foods, and you know, in that meal, that if you gear it towards those leaner proteins, you know, if you're looking for a protein source and having maybe a meatless, meaning not land meat, but having some fish protein is often really important too, because we're getting a different variety of nutrients as opposed to what we're used to on a normal basis.
And, you know, I'm also thinking, I'm a big fan of leftovers. And, you know, we use leftovers in my house, and I don't hesitate now to buy a little bit more of whatever fish, you know, maybe it's salmon, a little more than just my husband and I can eat in one day, because if you wrap it well, you know, clear plastic in a bowl or something, and put it in the refrigerator right away, the next day it's fine. And so it's kind of like having two special meals, you know. So, and I love the idea too, Chris. I freeze some seafood as well, because I like having it on hand when I get the urge to cook something like that.
I think that point about leftovers is great too, Joanne, because you can even think about, you know, turning your leftover seafood into something different and, you know, creating again. And I'm thinking back to the slide that Rachel showed us towards the beginning with how well or not well US residents do with meeting the dietary guidelines for Americans. And thinking back to that slide, everybody fell short of eating enough seafood, basically across the board by age group. But if we look back, the people who did the best in terms of came the closest to eating the recommended amount of seafood were in the age group of 50 to 70 years old. So linking that up with, you know, what I shared about mercury, the women of childbearing age are really missing the mark on what's recommended to get all of those beneficial omega-3s for themselves, and their kids are also falling short. So maybe leftovers are kind of a creative way to think about incorporating seafood into some new things. And, I would just kind of add to that, we've shown a lot of different examples of different kinds of seafood tonight. So experiment and see what you like and what your family likes and try different things. And, it might take some experimentation, but you might get to a rotation of 2 or 3 or 16 different kinds of seafood dishes that, your family really likes. And then you can incorporate them over time with different seasons and trying them out with different things.
I think I like making pizza, homemade pizza dough and everything. And probably my favorite pizzas have had leftover shrimp on top, or salmon even, or even like using some diced clams on a pizza. If you haven't done it, you should give it a try. It's pretty good.
I had a pizza that had the crab on it with some big red tomatoes and chunky tomatoes and the fresh cheese. It was real fresh herbs on it. It was really good. Yeah, it's a good, you can be creative with it. It's fun to add the different things. And the tacos, I don't think we eat tacos that are chicken or beef anymore. All the fajitas or the tacos are done with seafood now, because it's a good way to add it in. And again, that lighter flaky, sometimes you can get the lighter flaky fishes that go great in the tacos, and it's a little less expensive than some of the more expensive things to have, and a way to have it.
I'm going to guess that I'll ask Doug about this. Perhaps dogfish would be good in some of those recipes, where it's maybe tucked into a sauce or any thoughts there?
Yeah, so bringing up dogfish, and Chris made the shout out before, there's a lot of interest in also, there's a suite of species that are coined underutilized, where a lot of the catch quota is not caught. And that is often the case, not because they're not necessarily out there in the ocean, but there might not be enough of a market demand. So things like skates and dogfish, in particular, there's a lot of fish left out in the ocean because there's not much market demand for them on the seafood side of things. So encouraging folks to eat that fresh, healthy, local seafood, and dogfish is a great option. Actually, the smooth and spiny dogfish. Spiny dogfish, most of it goes to Europe for fish and chips. Smooth dogfish, don't know the market dynamics quite as much, but I've had fried of each and fish tacos with smooth dogfish, and they're great. You wouldn't know if you're eating smooth dogfish versus haddock, even when I had them. So if you see something like that, venture in those directions too and give them a try. Cool. On that note, we're just a couple minutes past the scheduled time, but that's great. And I'll thank everybody who participated with us this evening, both live or follow up and watch the recording. Thank you to the great speakers tonight, and also Lisa and myself last week. Our 2-night mini webinar series here on What's the Catch, New Jersey Seafood and Healthy Living. There'll be a follow-up program evaluation coming via email, so your feedback will be great. If we can hear how you enjoyed the program, ways we can improve this and other extension programs moving forward, that'll be great. Along with that, you'll soon be getting access to the recordings and also the additional resources that were mentioned in particular this evening on New Jersey seafood, health and nutrition related. Also, I'll put in the chat again, we have a seminar, complimentary seminar on Monday night on U.S. seafood from 2 speakers coming from NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. So myself and the team, we hope that you found the information tonight and last Thursday interesting and useful. October's National Seafood Month, part of which is to inspire more consumption, support the local industries and the health and nutrition guidelines, and particularly during a time of year when seafood sales sometimes slump, heading into the holidays and the cold winter months. So considering having more seafood on your plates around the holidays, not just some of the other traditional meat options that you might typically choose. Hopefully this information tonight continues to be a good reference. So when you are not floundering around, when you go to try to make your seafood, sorry, and you feel confident in knowing about what to select and how to cook and prepare it. So everybody be well and Catch you later.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.